In our last video, I made the claim that there are 20 families of Pokemon in Generation 1 that are not even from the Generation 1 region of Kanto. This brought up a lot of great discussion, and I want to thank all of you who left comments contributing to that discussion. It really gave me a lot to think about. So here's our list from last time, and if you're wondering why any of these are not Kanto Pokemon, you probably haven't seen the last video. If that's you, check that out first so we're on the same page. I think that the only immediate modification I want to make based on our discussions last time is to move Porygon from the gift category to his own category of digital, but that's it for now. I also won't be talking about the legendaries since even though they're limited encounters, they do seem to be native to the Kanto region. I'll get to Snorlax a little later though. To get some easy ones out of the way, Mew is probably native to the Guyana region of, Earth. It doesn't make any sense, but that's probably the best we're going to get, especially when looking at Gen 1 games. And I want to focus on the game canon as much as possible because the world of the anime and the manga and everything else really do seem to exist in another world than the game does, for better or for worse. So Mew isn't actually from any region in the games at all. And if Shigeki Morimoto hadn't snuck Mew into the game right before its release, it probably would have ended up being a Johto Pokemon instead of a Kanto Pokemon being released in Generation 2 events. Or maybe never at all. Maybe it was just meant to be lore for Mewtwo, but we can never know, except that if we want to be more accurate, we can call it a Guyana Pokemon rather than a Kanto Pokemon. As for Missingno, it's from the Game Boy. Should I put it into the digital section? I don't know. It's weird, it's fun, I love it, but let's move on. The fossil Pokemon are pretty easy to categorize, at least Ammonite and Kabuto are. Their fossils are found in Mount Moon, so they probably lived in the ancient Kanto region long before it was recognizable as Kanto. As I mentioned in the last video, the Old Amber is actually gifted to the player by a Pewter Museum scientist, meaning that it wasn't necessarily found in Kanto. The scientist could have found it in Mount Moon, but we have no evidence of that. The first region where Old Ambers can be found by the player is actually Sinnoh, so Aerodactyl may have been native to ancient Sinnoh, but Aerodactyl is nowhere to be found in Legends Arceus, which complicates things a bit. In the same generation, Old Ambers can be found in Heart Gold and Soul Silver through Rock Smash, but they aren't found in Gen 2's Johto, making this more of a convenience or a retcon of sorts, which is fine. But let's take a look at the original Old Amber artwork for perhaps another clue. There's no feather or any other bird pieces inside, but instead a big mosquito-like bug. Obviously, Aerodactyl isn't a mosquito, but we can infer that the idea is that the scientists are reviving the Aerodactyl from blood sucked by the mosquito. The blood has Aerodactyl's DNA, and the mosquito itself is discarded. Now, in later generations, the mosquito is absent from the artwork because at some point, the Pokemon teams decided that there should be no life forms other than Pokemon and humans in the Pokemon world. There's never been any attempt to put something like a feather or a tooth in any Old Amber artwork anywhere as far as I know, so who knows how they're reviving those Aerodactyl without the blood from the mosquito. But anyways, what we can possibly deduce from this is that Aerodactyl didn't need to live in the ancient Sinnoh or Johto regions to produce these suitable Old Ambers for their revival. The mosquitoes could have sucked blood from the Aerodactyl from wherever they lived, flown over to the ancient Johto and Sinnoh regions, and then got preserved in what would become the Old Ambers that would end up underground in these Generation 4 regions. Of course, being extinct, Aerodactyl can't be caught in the wild in any generation except in Gen 8's DLC, and I don't think there's anything especially weird about the Giant's Bed in Galar, but they're ancient Pokemon, so they're not necessarily from there. Maybe that's just where they all headed after the failed breed and release attempts by players that were breeding for IVs or something. So we can place Aerodactyl in ancient Sinnoh if we're willing to ignore their absence from Legends Arceus, and if not, it's really just impossible to determine. All thanks to that little mosquito. But let's get back to some easier ones, like Lapras. It appears as an overworld encounter in Johto's Union Cave, and it even respawns weekly. That makes it a Johto native Pokemon in my books. As for the other gift Pokemon, I mentioned Eevee as being one of the most egregious examples of a traditional Kanto Pokemon, not being from anywhere near Kanto, and in my last video, I said it was first catchable in the wild in Gen 6. Some commenters mentioned that Eevee can be caught in the Trophy Garden in Gen 4, but those Pokemon are explicitly not native to the region. They're only available after getting the National Dex and only catchable because the garden's owner has a butler who imports them whenever the owner claims that the Pokemon is there. So this means that Eevee and Porygon, while we're at it, are not native to Sinnoh. The Trophy Garden is just like another Safari Zone. Eevee is also catchable in the Pokewalker's Sightseeing course in Gen 4, but the Pokewalker doesn't count. I'm not saying a Pokemon is native to an external device, unless it's Missingno or something. Now, one thing that I did miss in my initial video that was brought up by Nimblewright1992 was that Eevee is actually catchable in the wild in Gen 5. In Black and White 2, Eevee is catchable in Castelia Park in Castelia City, which would make it native to Unova. It's definitely a lot more common in future regions, but hey, if Farfetch'd can be native to Kanto for popping up in one patch of grass in one version of the game at a low encounter rate, then Eevee can be native to Unova. Next up are Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan, who are actually evolved Pokemon. I keep forgetting that, despite this happening in Generation 2. But in Gen 2, pre-evolution Tyrogue is still a gift-exclusive Pokemon, just like its Gen 1 evolutions, so the Hitmons are not native Johto Pokemon either. The first time Tyrogue can be caught in the wild is Generation 4, but it needs the Poké Radar to be caught, which is kinda iffy in my opinion. It's clear that they live there, but when it requires post-game content to be available in main story regions, it's kind of an exception. Same situation in Gen 5. Tyrogue only swarms after getting the National Dex. In Gen 6, it's in the Friend Safari or a hidden Pokemon requiring the Dex Nav in the Gen 3 remakes, so more gray areas in my opinion. It's not until Generation 8 where Tyrogue can be found wandering in the wild without any extra technology or post-game credentials to make it appear. So while it could be argued to be a Sinnoh native Pokemon, I would personally lean towards putting it in Galar. If you disagree, that's cool. I could hear an argument for either gen. I personally think it belongs in Galar. Porygon was probably the Pokemon that got the most debate in our last video. Some argued that since, like Mewtwo, it was created in Kanto, it should be a Kanto Pokemon. But I'm not sure if we actually know that it was designed, programmed, or even produced in Kanto. Was it Team Rocket's first attempt at creating a man-made Pokemon before Mewtwo? Bulbapedia's artificial Pokemon page says it was created in Cinnabar Lab by Silphco, which ultimately cites back to a Japanese Pokemon book produced by Creatures Inc., so canon, sure, but even so, I don't feel comfortable calling it a Kanto Pokemon when it's not anywhere in the wild over there. So where else can it be obtained? Other than by gift, or whatever you call obtaining it from the game corner, there's the Trophy Garden in Gen 4, which, as I mentioned, doesn't really count as the wild. There's the White Forest in Gen 5, but it only comes along with a particular trainer. Again, not really native to the wild here. Gen 6's Ruby and Sapphire remakes give us Mirage Island and Mirage Mountain to catch Porygon in the post-game, but I think the word Mirage gives away that these aren't normal locations. I don't think these count either. In Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, they're catchable in the wild in Route 7, but these games exist solely to make all Gen 1 Pokemon catchable. So technically catchable in the wild, but the Let's Go games barely even count as games, let alone canon, right? All that's left is Legends Arceus's Space-Time Distortions, whose name again suggests that it's not a normal place in the wild. And then the Terrarium from the Scarlet and Violet DLC, which is basically a gigantic safari zone. So I think it's safe to say that Porygon doesn't actually exist in the wild at all, which makes sense, it's a digital Pokemon. Now if you really want to call the Let's Go games canon, then I guess Porygon is catchable in the wild in Generation 7, but either way, our digital Pokemon Porygon is clearly an abomination of nature and probably shouldn't exist at all. Maybe we need to tell this to OpenAI before they start trying to put ChatGPT into animals. Moving on to something a bit more, based in reality, are the starter Pokemon. Game Freak always makes all of the starters elusive, but the Gen 1 Pokemon always do get special treatment, and considering how many other trainers have these Pokemon in the Gen 1 games, we might find something good here. Now, all of them are catchable in Gen 7's Pokemon Let's Go, but again, those are basically halfway games designed to bring the more casual Pokemon Go players into the series on console, and starters are notoriously abundant in Pokemon Go. Being unable to catch the starters and other mascot Pokemon would have been a deal breaker for the casuals, so Game Freak tweaked the Let's Go games to make the starters much less special. So is it non-canon, a retcon, or canon, or just questionable? You decide. Anyways, aside from Let's Go, all of the Gen 1 starters are also catchable in the wild in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, but only with the QR scanner. They are also available in Gen 8's Diamond and Pearl remakes in the Great Underground, but only after getting the National Dex. And I believe that all starters from all gens are available in the Terrarium and Gen 9's DLC, which definitely doesn't count as the wild. So where are the Kanto starter Pokemon from? Well, if I'm stuck between saying they're from Alola due to the QR scanner or Kanto due to Let's Go, I'm gonna say that, like Porygon, they don't exist, I guess. I don't know, man. They're from the grass outside of Pallet Town, and by the time the Let's Go games rolled around, they'd been bred and released for decades from people hunting for shinies. That's the best I've got. Snorlax is catchable in Kanto, but there are a limited number of them, and it's the same in Johto. One could argue that they're Kanto Pokemon because they do seem to live there, but since they're in such limited and non-renewable quantities, I'm gonna dig deeper. Now, like any good Gen 1er, I keep forgetting that Snorlax is actually an evolved Pokemon, and an infinite number of Munchlax can be caught in Sinnoh, so I'd argue that's where Snorlax are native to. Now, I say an infinite number, somewhat in jest, because they are ridiculously annoying to catch. But they're there. The in-game trades were always my favorite because it made me wonder where they got the Pokemon from. If you watched the last video, you'd know that Farfetch'd and Lickitung are catchable in the wild in yellow, and Jinx is catchable in the wild in Japanese blue. This leaves us with Mr. Mime as the only Gen 1 in-game trade that can't be caught in Kanto at all. Was it going to be catchable in the wild in Pokemon Pink? Who knows? So let's see which gen we can catch Mr. Mime in. Okay. It's catchable in Route 21, in Gen 2, so it's definitely a Johto Pokemon. Route 21 of Kanto. Yeah, I mentioned last time that maybe Mr. Mime was on vacation. I don't know. What the heck, Game Freak? I was ready to say that Mr. Mime is a Sinnoh Pokemon because both it and Mime Jr. are catchable in Sinnoh, but it's definitely catchable in Kanto in Gen 2, the Johto gen. So is it a Johto Pokemon the way that Houndour is? Who knows? There's a whole fan theory rabbit hole you can jump down about Team Rocket messing with a Dark and Psychic type Pokemon in Gen 1, so maybe Mr. Mime got caught up in that. Or maybe Gen 2 Kanto Pokemon shouldn't count as canon? Who knows? Debate. I mentioned in the last video that the Safari Zone Pokemon were likely imported into Kanto, so they probably shouldn't count as native Kanto Pokemon. Not everyone agrees with this, but again, I'll reference African Lion Safari and, well, just about every zoo you can think of. Like real zoos, the Safari Zone has some Pokemon that are native to Kanto, and some Pokemon that aren't. So let's talk about the ones that aren't. Dratini is catchable in Johto's Dragon Den, Tauros is catchable in Johto Routes 38 and 39, and Exeggcute is catchable from headbutting trees in Johto. Alright, 3 easy ones to knock off the list. Now, a lot of people brought up Exeggcute being native to Gen 6's Alola because it gets its true evolution of Alolan Exeggutor there. Now, I'm not sure if that means that Exeggcute is native to Alola, or if they just happen to grow better in that region. But either way, Exeggcute are supposed to reproduce by having an Exeggutor lose one of its heads, which are actually seeds, and then that former head goes on to become part of an Exeggcute. This method of reproduction wouldn't really work for cross-regional spread. The Exeggcute eggs, or seeds, are not really small enough to be carried across the region by accident the way that a lot of real-life seeds are. This is especially the case for the Alola region. Unless Alolan Exeggutor were swimming across oceans to get to other regions, or other Pokemon were carrying their seeds across the oceans for some reason and somehow, I don't think this is possible. So I think that the Alolan Exeggutor may not be the original form of Exeggcute, even if it is the true form. But animals being better suited to regions they're not native to is definitely something that happens in nature, so I think I do make a fair argument for Exeggcute being a Johto Pokemon. Also, I'm going by the first generation that these non-Kanto Pokemon are natively catchable in, so Exeggcute is staying as a Johto Pokemon in my list. Scyther and Pinsir are also catchable in Johto, but only in the bug catching contest. Now, I might get some pushback for this, but I'm going to argue that this doesn't count, the same way the Safari Zone doesn't count. First of all, they're only catchable during the contest. Second of all, the contest only happens 3 days a week. Do the Scyther and Pinsir see everyone out there catching Pokemon, then hop out from the exterior trees to allow themselves to be caught? That's ridiculous, so I'm gonna say no. They're probably released into the park specifically for the contest. Probably by the rich parents of Cool Trainer Nick so he can catch a Scyther and win that Sunstone every time. But seriously, the bug catching contest isn't just a ticket into the park, they're adding special bug Pokemon out there to make things more interesting. Thankfully, both Scyther and Pinsir are catchable in very normal areas in Gen 4, so I think that makes Scyther and Pinsir Pokemon that are native to Sinnoh. Kangaskhan, though, is another weird one. Like Mr. Mime, it's catchable in the wild in Generation 2, but only in Kanto, so it's not a Johto Pokemon. But even though it's not catchable in the wild in Gen 1, I'm going to argue that it is a Kanto Pokemon. And yes, even though I said otherwise in the last video, I'm standing firm on this here. It's just not a Gen 1 Kanto Pokemon. See, it's catchable in the basement of Rock Tunnel, which is right next to Pokemon Tower, and it's a rare encounter to boot. Players can also find Cubone and Marowak there, which, I believe, are part of the same evolutionary family as Kangaskhan, at least lore-wise. Yep, the Cubone are baby Kangaskhan theory. So where were the Kangaskhan in Gen 1? They were probably being mercilessly slaughtered by Team Rocket, as evidenced by the Marowak ghost and surrounding lore in Pokemon Tower. Since Gen 2 takes place 3 years after Gen 1, there was enough time for the Kangaskhan population to rebound. hence why they're catchable in Rock Tunnel by the time Gen 2 happens, probably thanks to the conservation efforts of the Safari Zone. Now, what would Team Rocket's motive be, to massacre Kangaskhan? No idea. It was a video game in the 90s. Villains didn't need motives to be evil. Maybe Giovanni had a personal grudge against them? But he uses a Kangaskhan. Maybe he wanted to be the only trainer with a Kangaskhan? Maybe he wanted to create Cubones? Is Cubone another example of a Pokemon created by Team Rocket? You decide. Anyways, that's finally all of the non-Kanto Gen 1 Pokemon. Thank you so much for watching to the end. I appreciate you. And if you'd like to share your thoughts, I'd love to hear them, even if it's just to tell me that you don't like the anglicized way that I say Kanto. But I've got a fun video on pronunciation of Pokemon planned, so maybe we'll get to that later. But that's all I've got for today. I've got some more Pokemon and non-Pokemon stuff planned, and as summer approaches, we might start seeing more of Safia in the coming months. If you're not up to speed, or if you just want a refresher, go check out her Let's Play of Pokemon Blue where she played it for the first time as her first Pokemon game. Hope to see you all around, and until next time, have an awesome day and an awesome week.